Hello, hello, hello. All right, let's continue on. We're doing the second part of Lecture 17. We're still in the middle of reform in America during the 19th century, the 1800s. All right, so um, the Monday lecture, whether you saw it in person or on video, ended with the sources with the ideas of reform. Where we're going to start today are the ideas of reform, the principles. All right. Only three things we're going to really cover, or like mainland Europeaners, three things. Three things we're going to hit with the principles. Local relief was no longer good enough. In other words, the whole idea of grassroots reform is a start, but it's not enough. You have to do more. It has to grow, it has to get bigger, it has to become more. So, these grassroots reforms, like abolitionism in places like Boston, Pennsylvania, has to grow into something bigger, into something more. Also, it goes back to what we talked about with humanism and rationalism. Remember, John Locke with tabula rasa. The whole idea of tabula rasa is we are born blank slates. The whole point in it is that we're not good or evil. Given our environment, given our education, given what we are, we can be more. If we create a perfect place, we can create a perfect people. Like we've been talking about, this week, the whole idea of utopianism is this idea of perfection, right? So the idea that man is innately good, we strive to succeed, we strive to make things. So if you put mankind in the position where they have the best education, the best family, the best environment, they will provide you with the best world. And that is American history. That is what we have strived for from the beginning, and it's what we're striving for now. I mean, the whole idea of reform, and it has popped back up again, right? The idea of change and reform, of making things better for all people. Also, during this time, with that Second Great Awakening, with this idea of humanism and rationalism, we have this moral dogmatism, this idea that we can make and have to make a better world because we know what is good. You have to have a little bit of arrogance. You have to have this drive, this passion to make a better world. And it's the best for everyone when you do. So, you know, we talked about the sources. Now we have our ideas for reform, that local relief is a start, but we have to go national. That through humanism, we see that man isn't perfect, but can be if we make a better world, which we have to strive for. And also, this moral dogmatism that we can do it. You need all of these things to continue forward. So, what we're going to talk about for the rest of this lecture is different movements, reform movements, different groups, different people that wanted to make a better world. All right. What we're going to start with is what many consider to be the original reform movement, which is temperance. Temperance was working on trying to regulate drinking in America. Like we talked about before, Americans were heavy drinkers. All right. Through the 1800s, American men drank enough absolute alcohol, meaning pure grain, PGA, moonshine, clear white, that you could dip a dirty engine in and clean it, booze, that these men drank enough of this pure alcohol to supply every man, woman, and child with 5 gallons a year. In other words, we were the drinkingest, heaviest drinking culture in the world in the 1800s. All right, to give you an idea, I've told you guys this, you guys and gals, this before, that the average American man drank on average about 6 to 7 shots a day. The actual statistic is 6.8 shots a day. So, the young kids, not sure if you've been exposed. You're not 21 yet, but if you're like anything like me and many other Americans throughout our history, you have. Whiskey, the modern booze of the modern era, is, 40 to 47 proof. That's if you get whiskey, bourbon, gin, or vodka. But pure grain, that means no dilution whatsoever. So it's pure alcohol. So men were taking basically 7 shots of pure alcohol instead of the 40 to 47 completely pure. All right. So this had started causing problems. As you can imagine, men were abandoning families. They were abandoning jobs. They were only doing what it took to drink and play. A lot like what we talked about in colonial America in the South. So this is why the temperance movement was created. It wasn't trying to eliminate alcohol, which would have been impossible, because alcohol was everywhere. I mean, women, children, and men drank it. Men drank the heavy stuff, but the beer, the wine, anything else like the lessers, the smaller, was drank by the women and kids. All right. Even all the way to the 1930s during the Great Depression, kids would go to the bar with buckets to get beer to take home. All right. If you've ever heard from the bottle to the teat, well, actually, I'm sorry, from the teat to the bottle, it means from nursing to the bottle. From the teat to the bottle. It's all about, and it's where it originates is this idea that once kids stopped breastfeeding, one of the things they did drink was beer. It was a women and kids drink. This was something that was safer than many of the other drinks of the time for everybody. And with beer, now that's another class. All right. But this is considered by the 30s, 40s, and on to have become an American problem. The temperance movement was pushing for just the drawing back of drinking, not the elimination of it, because that would be impossible and crazy. Because it's not what you can do. When you tell people they can't do something, they're going to do it anyway. And it's only going to cause problems. So what the temperance movement was looking for is how to temper drinking. Temper or temperance comes from the ancient Greek, meaning to moderate. What you want to do is moderate what people are doing. Have a moderation, have something that is not over the top. Alcohol, of course, had been and had become what most Americans considered aquavitae. That's even actually the name, the original Latin name, the original UK Celtic Irish name for whiskey. Whiskey actually means aquavitae. It means the water of life. So what they wanted to do was to temper the use of this booze, all the boozes, to make sure that it didn't disrupt work, family, and growth. Men had gotten way too deep into this, so the temperance movement was created to try to, like I said, with temperance, it means moderate. So, this is our first major movement, reform movement in America. This was your first key point. Well, not first. This is your second key point of the day because we were still doing, the ideas of reform. So we have our first two key points, right? So the next is I'm going to move into education. This is another major reform movement. We've talked about it a lot. This was a major part of cultural nationalism. This was one of the key things that Jefferson wanted. This is one of the key things that Jefferson believed could create this American utopia. So, with this education movement, the major people, some of the first people that really took this to heart and pushed it was in the Northeast, and they were Horace Mann and Bronson Alcott. All right. They're the ones that really pushed and created the idea of early childhood development. All right. Early childhood development is basically the beginning of our public education system, right? So, all right. Horace Mann, Bronson Alcott start this movement off. And it continues to expand through the 1800s. And it would grow and grow and grow into our public education system, all right? It would hit its pinnacle in the 1950s and 60s, where we would turn out some of the most educated people in world history. And then the US government would just snatch that shit away from us. Less and less would be spent on education. The 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, and on into today, American government has drastically reduced the education of the people. All right. One of the things that you'll see is that with education, one of the things that would pop up with Alcott and Mann is the push for teachers. All right. And most of the teachers that they would recruit and put into the field to do this were women. The way they looked at it, this was important because women were the original educators. Women taught the kids. Women raised the kids. Women had a connection with the kids. So the idea of the female teacher becomes a thing in the mid-1800s and would continue on with public education, with education in general. And this would be what would become standard in education. So, we have two of our first major reform movements, temperance and education. And like we talked about, education, teaching or giving people the opportunity to learn how to critically think, how to understand the world around them, and make a better world for themselves and everybody around them, has been of huge importance since Jefferson. This, like we really talked about, this was a huge thing for him. But, like I said, since the 1970s, it has become less and less of something the American government gives a shit about. Also, so let's keep going. Next, let's talk about some of the other movements. Let's talk about some of the reforms that would be pushed to change things. All right. Let's start with the health and science movement. This is a big thing. This is another major one. One of the things that would occur out of this are health spas. All right. Not only health spas, but what we would consider retreats where people of money can go to relax. All right. So this starts in the 1800s. Some of the first health spas really worked on diet, the idea of creating a perfect diet for people. And this is where Sylvester Graham comes in. All right. Sylvester Graham is the first person in American history that starts a huge movement to push vegetarianism. All right. So he starts up and really pushes vegetarianism. With vegetarianism, Graham starts creating what he considers the perfect diet to create the perfect people. But, all right, wait for it. Here's what makes it very American. All right, here we go. What makes it very American is not only are you having this vegetarian diet, but what wraps it all up and finishes all the other nutrition you need are the very healthy and very needed graham crackers. All right, I'm sure you've heard of graham crackers before. I'm sure you've gone camping or at least have heard of s'mores. The idea of chocolate, like marshmallows and graham crackers. So, Graham pushes a vegetarian diet supplemented with his much needed graham crackers. So, what does this mean? What it means is he's selling shit. It's capitalism. He's pushing vegetarianism, but he's pushing it to sell something. All right. Also, during this time, phrenology would become a major thing. I'm sure you guys have seen the white solid casts of heads, and they're divided off with different sections. You see the face, but all of these different sections have different words on them. And these are phrenology things. The idea of phrenology comes from the Fowler brothers. The Fowler brothers start up in Germany, and it expands to the Western world. This would become a very big push here in the US. All right. Here in the US, the Fowler brothers would really support the idea of racism, eugenics, and many other things, which is horrific. Why that happens is with phrenology, the idea is you could go around a person's skull. You could feel the lumps, the fissures, the indentions, and you could tell whether or not they were intelligent or stupid, whether they were a good person or a criminal. You could tell everything about these people by feeling around. All right. So, phrenology becomes a big thing. It's a major thing. You could get a PhD in phrenology all the way up to the 1920s here in the US. At Harvard, nonetheless. So, we have this. But we also have legitimate medical progressions, legitimate medical breakthroughs. And the main one I want to focus on is Edward Jenner. All right. We learned about sanitation and cleaning and everything else to make everything sanitary to help things by the 20th century. But Edward Jenner would be the first to give us a vaccine for smallpox. All right. Let it resonate. Smallpox. Pax Americana. The thing that in America people said the only thing that killed as many people as God was smallpox. The disease that depleted the American population by more than 80%, which would allow European colonization without much of a fight. The disease of the Americas, Pax Americana. Edward Jenner would create a vaccine, and it's eliminated. It goes worldwide, and it's eliminated. Vaccines, from this point on, become a major part of what makes it possible for us to grow as a human species, as cultures. This allows us to survive one of the most catastrophic and killing diseases of all time. So, think about it. Vaccination. Very important. We've learned how to do it. It's been heavily tested. This is something that creates a herd immunity. I'm sure you guys have heard this in the current environment. You can't have a herd immunity without a vaccination. You need people to be vaccinated to create a herd immunity. That's just fact. All right. So, to create and push and promote the death of some of the most deadly viruses and diseases, things like smallpox, vaccinations, well, just like with smallpox, polio, and a lot of the other things that we had almost eradicated in the modern world. Mumps, measles, flu, vaccinations play a big role. All right. Also, we also have the idea of rehabilitation. This focuses on the mentally, the criminals, and the prostitutes. The idea of rehabilitation. The idea of helping them learn a new way and become a part of mainstream society where they're not harming themselves and others. All right? So, rehabilitation becomes a major thing in the 1800s in prisons. The idea of when a person goes into a jail or is guilty of a crime, they teach them, especially if they're thieves, they teach them a trade. They give them options. And once they get out, they can get a job. They can get a job in mainstream society and take care of themselves and a family if they want to. And they're accepted in these new worlds for themselves. And this is a major part of how America would change the world. This idea of rehabilitation had never occurred. Criminals throughout world history, especially in the Western, Middle Eastern, and the Far East, the idea was these were incorrigible people. You just needed to keep them contained and separated or dead. But one of the things that we proved beyond all doubt in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s with rehabilitation, if people were given the option and were taught how to take care of themselves and could have a real job where it wouldn't hurt people, the majority of Americans, the majority of people would take that option. Most people, all they want to do is take care of themselves and their family. If they're given that option where they can create a good living for themselves and those around them, they're not going to choose theft, murder. They're going to choose what builds and creates a better world for themselves and others. But when people are not given the option of improving themselves, what choice do they have? Think about this. This is a major problem right now with our prison system. Throughout America, we have more Americans incarcerated than ever before. Not only that, more people are incarcerated in America than any other country in the world. We are an incarceration system. We have created and turned into this idea of throwing these people away into the system because it's been given to private corporations. All right. With this, we're not giving people options. The people that have nothing, that struggle to get something, if they're caught in their criminal ways, they're gone. And a lot of people that get caught doing stuff that's not necessarily criminal get thrown into this system and then become criminals. All right. So rehabilitation is a real thing. And the idea of rehabilitation does work. The modern prison system in America doesn't work. It's completely broken. It's completely lopsided. It completely focuses on the poor, and it's racist. It's something that we have to break down, get rid of completely, and start over. And go back to the idea of rehabilitation. Also, asylums. Asylums are a big thing during this time. This was typically in the 1800s, a thing that was focused on that churches did. This is where family members that were crazy or unmanageable were sent to. And what they did is basically throw them into cells and let them die. All right. Throw them in cells, let them die. Minimal care, very little, if any, thought was given to them. Also, during this time, we started pushing for rehabilitation of these people, and doctors started looking into ways to help. All right. During this time, it really didn't work because it was a lot of like opium, heroin, cocaine. If that didn't work, just scramble their brains. But this is the push for modern mental health care that would grow over time. All right. This is a major thing. It's a very important thing. It's something that Americans still haven't accepted, that we need to accept. That mental health is just as important as physical health. All right. So we have temperance. We have the education movement. We have the health and science going with spas, going with diet, phrenology, the medical with smallpox and sanitation, rehabilitation, and we also have one of the major movements of the time, abolitionism. All right. Um, Abolitionism was the push to end slavery now. All right. But we can go back. This is a push for some people. But throughout American history, especially with the founding fathers like Jefferson and Madison, they believed slavery was evil. Some of them believed it was a necessary evil, but they still wanted to get rid of it. So people like Madison, James Madison, you remember Madison, hopefully. You should remember Madison because Madison was our father of the Constitution. He gave us the Virginia Plan. He laid out our three-tier government. He is also the one that gave us our Bill of Rights. Madison believed that slavery should be ended, like Jefferson. And Madison pushed for the idea of what's known as colonization. All right. Colonization was pushed by Madison and also by African Americans of the time. People like Paul Coffey. Coffey was a free African American that promoted and pushed the idea that the only way Africans could be free, slaves could be free, was for these African American people to go back to Africa. So Madison and Coffey and many others would push what's known as colonization. The colonization movement would be a major thing in early America during that early 1800s time frame. Madison and many others would promote this, and they would end up buying territory in the west coast of Africa so that Americans and the American government could send freed African Americans back to Africa. All right. Think about this. All right. You have American colonies bought and paid for in Africa to create new countries, to send African Americans back to Africa. They had been here for 100 years, basically. They had learned American customs, American ways. They were slaves. They didn't even know where the previous generations had come from. All right. That's like saying at that time to send Madison and the English Americans back to England. We're Americans by this point. Ingrained, whether you wanted to be or you didn't want to be. We were a new world. So the colonization movement was pushed on this idea that African Americans would never be accepted into American society, so they should be sent back to Africa. I'm sure everybody's heard of the Back to Africa movement. This is colonization. That whole idea is ridiculous. They're not Africans, they're Americans. Mistreated Americans, but Americans still in and of itself. So, We have colonization, and it slowly dissipates because, believe it or not, hey, the government doesn't want to pay for anything. It's a big surprise. The other group to begin things are the gradualists. The gradualists start with people like Ben Franklin and the Quakers during the 1700s and on into the 1800s. They believe that slavery is immoral, is evil, and has to be gotten rid of. But we have to do it slowly, and we have to do it in a way where when these people are released, they can be a part of the world around them and be accepted. All right. So we have two of our major types of anti slavery: colonization and gradualization. What we're going to finish up with today is the anti slavery movement. All right. What most people think of as the anti slavery movement are abolitionists. All right. Um, Abolitionists believe and believed, well, they believed in the immediate freedom of the African American people, to liberate all of them and incorporate them into American society. All right. So, abolitionists weren't gradualists, that this would happen over time, or colonists free them and send them back. The idea of the abolitionist that these men and women that were African American slaves were people. All right. With this, we have several people I want to talk about. All right. You're supposed to be watching a video right now. This is an assignment for you guys on Frederick Douglass and write a paper on it. He is one of the most important people to me of the 1800s. All right. So do it. Get your grade, right? All right. Other than Douglass, who was an abolitionist that fought once he escaped for slavery. I'm not going to give anything away about him, so because I want you to watch the video. He was one of the major activists for abolitionism. Before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after it, until he died. It's also important to remember that it will come up in the video. This is a man that fought for not only African American rights, but women's rights and Native American rights. This is a true reformer, and one of the ones I consider one of the major heroes, one of the major people that pushed for positive change in American history. But let's talk about the abolitionists. A lot of them were rich white people that it would never affect. But it was something they considered evil morally, according to religion. It never affected them. It never would really affect them in any way. And what they would do is contribute money to freeing these people, but never really giving a shit about anybody. However, there were major people in the abolitionist movement that would make a huge difference. All right. One of them is William Lloyd Garrison. He would start The Liberator, a major newspaper, and he would be he would be the first first major American protester that would use peaceful protest. Garrison pushed the idea that slavery was a moral evil, but not only that, that African Americans were equal to white people. Not all abolitionists did this. Not many abolitionists did this, actually. But Garrison was one of these guys. Garrison pushed that the idea of slavery not only was a moral evil, but was something that would destroy the idea of democracy, because in America, we were based on the idea of freedom. All right. So, Garrison with The Liberator would be a major influence. He was a pacifist, never would be violent, went all over America with numerous people and started numerous movements, and would numerous times be beaten, stoned, and almost hung, even in the North. He was not a popular man in the beginning. He would keep pushing this. Frederick Douglass would see him for the first time when Frederick Douglass took his first vacation. And it was to go to see a William Lloyd Garrison speech. He would be inspired by Garrison. He would introduce himself to Garrison, and he and Garrison would become just interlocked and become major players in the movement of true freedom in America. All right. We also have Sojourner Truth, Isabella Baumfree. She was born and raised in New York. That's why I bring her up. Isabella Baumfree, Sojourner Truth, had a lot of kids. They would all be sold off. She was from New York. She would then go and get into preaching. Sojourner Truth means that she is a pilgrim of truth. She is preaching of truth. All right. She is one of the people that a lot of people have heard of. So you have Sojourner Truth. You also have Harriet Tubman of the Underground Railroad. If you are doing the podcast, The Dollop, you have and will listen to the story of one of my favorite Americans, a true revolutionary. So, with the immediatists, we have Garrison, we have Douglass, we have Sojourner Truth, we also have David Walker. All right. Out of all of these people, which were radicals at the time, Walker steps it up well past anything that anybody can handle. Walker writes what I consider to be one of the most important manifestos, one of the most important documents for human freedom since the Declaration of Independence. It's called An Appeal to the colored citizens of the world. All right. With Walker, he was basically what we consider a thrift store owner. He owned a secondhand clothing store in Boston, which was one of the safer places in the U.S. for African Americans. But he was a complete radical. With this appeal, he pushed the idea that if African Americans or Africans anywhere in the world pushed and promoted for their freedom and their rights, if they did not attain them immediately, they should rebel. Fight. So, huge document on major push. Walker would be found beaten to death on the doorstep of his business in the most radical and anti-slavery place in America. So, Walker, I've always seen him to relate it to people you've probably heard of. Stokely Carmichael, right? Or Malcolm X, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, a radical reformer pushing for and trying to attain African American equality. Also, of course, we have Douglass. Douglass, you're watching the video on and writing a paper on for me, so I'm not going to get into it. I want you guys to watch this and just ascertain and kind of get your own idea of it. And then what I'm going to end this with is William Whipper. All right. William Whipper was an African American, a freeborn African American in the state of South Carolina. A freeborn African American in South Carolina, right there, is kind of revolutionary. South Carolina, especially through the 1800s, and hell, I worked and lived there for a while. I still consider it highly racist. Whipper pushed what he wrote. His treatise, his little gift to the world, was an address on non-resistance to offensive aggression. Can you get what that is? It's huge for the modern world. It's peaceful protest. Right? Henry David Thoreau would push peaceful protest. William Whipper would push peaceful protest. Fyodor Dostoevsky would push this. This would move on into peaceful protest in the modern 20th century, where we'd have such luminaries, such important people like Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, and many others that would push, as they saw it, the best way to do things. Find what's wrong, peacefully protest, and accept the evils which are given to you to exact change. It's my gospel. It is a very important one. I think that we have adopted and have made in American history. I think it's one that creates positive change without negativity. And that's what we need to focus on. Is this idea of loving one another and creating a better world. Like I've told you guys and gals from the beginning of this, reform has been one of my main focuses, foci, however you want to put it. One of the things I've done in my academic career. And I really think that this push is the way the idea of change can come from love. Take care of one another. Strive for this idea. Make a better world. I know I went over this time, but to put reform into 2 lectures, you're very lucky. I could spend an entire semester on this shit. Good night and good luck.